Welcome everyone. I'm excited for our session today. This is first of what I hope to be an upcoming trend. Really just hang out with smart, accomplished folks and talk about interesting things. And I'm grateful for our first session to be a really strong one. For those who don't know me, my background's tech and cybersecurity, and I've helped build a few business-to-business software as a service companies across industries, all to successful transactions. And these industries include fintech, health tech, and insurtech. The health tech company, Cover My Meds, was a C-Bus tech unicorn. Currently, I'm building my company Gamma Force, where we help tech and health tech companies with cybersecurity strategy. And we also help with execution, ongoing management of security programs, as well as cloud and security engineering. I'm super excited to be here today with Dan Manges. Dan's a friend and has a well-notched belt when it comes to health, tech companies in general, both as an entrepreneur and as a CTO. He cut his teeth as CTO building a fintech company, Braintree, which many of you have probably heard of. Braintree sold for $800 million in an acquisition. Later, as co-founder and CTO of Root Insurance, Root being another C-Bus tech unicorn, they were valued at over $1 billion when they went public. Dan's latest company, RWX, they're helping with developer experience, particularly through their product Mint, where Mint is a CI/CD tool that's badass with concurrency and has more sophisticated or failure scenarios. So when builds fail or tests fail, it doesn't take out your entire build process in a way that ruins your entire production platform. So today you could say you get to hang out with a couple unicorn catchers today. It's interesting. We fielded questions from the audience in advance, and I'm going to use that to ground a lot of our discussion today, Dan. And surprisingly, without prompting, it really favored cybersecurity. But I thought we'd talk a bit today, at least about scaling tech and scaling teams and scaling companies. And well, Braintree was nearly a unicorn, and Root certainly was. What do you think is unique about taking a company from zero to $1 billion based on your experience?
Yeah, thanks for having me in the fireside chat, Warner. I think the biggest challenge, and I alluded to this in my LinkedIn post where I shared that we were going to be doing this today, is really just moving super fast in the early stages of the company, especially when you're just starting out. You don't know if you're building the right product or you're building in the right way, if the product's going to get the traction that you need, or you're going to have to pivot. You're experimental, you're prototyping, you're really just trying to get some customer validation, get a little bit of traction, try to find something that can have a semblance of product market fit. And in that sense, you don't want to over engineer things. You just want to learn as quickly as possible. But you also want to have a plan in mind for what's going to happen if things do go well. At both Braintree and Root, those companies grew really rapidly. I mean, Root especially. Like, we founded the company in 2015 and went public in 2020. So to go from zero to IPO in 5 years was just remarkably fast. And at the point at which I left in 2021, I believe we had about 250 people in engineering, which was a really large team to, again, come together like that quickly. So I'd say the biggest challenge to actually grow is just figuring out how to set yourself up to mature at the right pace, like commensurate with the stage that the company is at without overdoing it in the early stages, but also without neglecting it too much, such that you don't have a solid foundation to build on once you go to hire more people and grow your team. And I think a lot of that applies to software architecture, but certainly also applies to cybersecurity.
Yeah, it's funny. I was thinking back to one of our early meetings at your office over on Gay Street, and that's when you're starting to build the engineering team more. And it's always interesting at that point, even in a company that's growing so fast, to go to IPO in 5 years. It doesn't feel like it at first, but it's so exponential when it really hits. And it reminded me of my early days at Cover My Meds. When I joined, it was about 20 or 30 folks, and folks were talking about how fast the company was growing. And
Mhm.
I think we were over 100 before it felt fast to me. But I I remember anecdote we had. uh, uh, we were hiring over 10 people every Monday. Over 10 people were starting near the peak of the growth. And it's just really crazy. I I I made some really strategic hires to get the foundation in place in the tech platform to enable that scale. And I do think that there are inflection points, particularly when it comes to technology and cybersecurity, but from a different angle, to get the right things in place early enough that it's not too complex, because retrofitting things like standardization, automation, and the way software is built, or the SDLC, once there's a lot of complexity there, it can be really difficult to retrofit. Um, but the biggest thing was getting the right folks on the rocket ship, so to speak, to co-op Sheryl Sandberg.
Yeah, no, I certainly agree with that. Like one thing I did in the early stages of building Root, which was extraordinarily difficult, was to hire engineers who had the capacity and experience of managing people, but were willing to join and basically take an IC role writing code. And this was really hard to do. It's already hard enough to find and hire talented engineers. Columbus is a decently sized market, but not huge. So to try to find people who were, had management experience, but yet hadn't been so far removed from writing code that they were too rusty, and to ask them to say, like, hey, I know you were the CTO of a previous startup, or you were a director of engineering over a couple of teams, but we have 7 engineers right now. I mostly just need people to write code, but I want to have I want to bring people in now who can learn the code base, learn the company, learn the domain, so that as we grow, I can grow a team underneath you. And I largely thought that would be effective just because I'd seen so many cases of organizations that would bring in leadership after the fact, where like the team would get really large, they didn't really have anybody that had management experience. Then you'd be trying to bring somebody in, but they wouldn't have any of the historical context on the organization. And there are managers who are capable of doing it and doing it extraordinarily well. And obviously, it does become important at a certain point to like bring people in at that level. But if you can kind of grow people from within and promote people into those positions as a company grows, I found that like it's a much more effective path. So that's kind of one example among many of moving fast in the really early stages of the company, but setting the company up for growth that worked well for us on the people front.
I like that a lot. And that's fairly unique. I've not heard anyone articulate an approach like that before. One of my pet peeves about tech companies is, and I like a lot of things about tech companies. I think you and I have chatted about this, Dan, where we have this predilection to promote our best engineers into management roles. They hit X amount of years at the company, or Y amount of years of experience, or they're too old to be on the keyboard, or look old enough to be a manager, whatever version of that anecdote you want. And I've seen folks forced into those roles, literally forced. And then usually over a couple years they cycle back into an IC role. And a different pattern that I've seen in big tech companies is, um, where they wouldn't hire people into senior manager, director, right? Director level roles. They'd want them to be an individual contributor first. And well, management's a completely different career path. We don't talk about it like that, but it's a completely different set of skills, and in effect, it's resetting one's career, and it's difficult and not the easiest job. So to put people into it who are highly skilled, and we need people who are skilled in those roles, as well as devalue those who have built the skills, wanting them to have top-notch engineering skills. Because if they still do as a director, they're probably not that great as a manager, because it's a lot of work developing those skills too. Like one part of that philosophy I do like. It took me a long time to get to this point, to have a version of that I think is true to the intent and less destructive in application. And that's having people, especially in middle management, engineering manager roles, definitely more team-facing management roles, having people who came from that professionally, people who had technical jobs and had some success at it, right? Not just because they're bad at it, they got promoted to manager. I see that too. That's ridiculous.
Sure.
Uh,
Yeah, yeah.
how do you balance that one, Dan?
Yeah, I think probably a little bit unorthodox on this front because I do think some of it depends on the organization itself and the processes and expectations of management within the organization. Um, but when you think about it like from the ground up, I've always viewed a manager's responsibility as effectively managing the output of their entire teams. They're responsible for the combined set of deliverables that that the people reporting to them are responsible for executing on. Um, and when you start there at the bottom and you think about that first level of management, you think about a technical profession like engineering, if you're the person responsible for, let's say, like 6 engineers in the work that they're doing, I personally think you do need to be pretty technical because I think you need to be able to deliver really great feedback to them to understand the contributions that people on your team are making and understand those from your own observations, not just from peer reviews. Um, be able to understand how that engineer is approaching the problems that they're being tasked with, understand like who on your team to task with which problem. Like delegation has to be one of the top responsibilities of management. And
Mm,
I think if you're tasking engineers with doing work and you don't have a great pulse on like what's going to be required to do that work and how that aligns with that engineer's skill set, I don't know how you could possibly effectively delegate like to your team. So I think at least at that very first level of management, people actually do need to be pretty technical, but it depends on the organization. Like everything I just described are the expectations that I would have for first level engineering managers. There are organizations where HR is driving a lot of this process, and there's a lot of expectations around facilitating HR processes. There's heavy expectations around facilitating just performance review process and like job leveling and everything that goes into just kind of the broader corporations management practices. And probably the more of that creeps in, the more you do need to figure out like what the right balance of skill set is. And some organizations even do delineate between like tech leads and engineering managers because they have so much process from the organizational expectations that they need somebody to just solely execute that. And then they need a separate tech lead to do everything I was just describing of like, how do you effectively utilize people towards like this set of goals? But obviously, as you start working your way up the organization, it becomes a little bit different. When you're talking about a manager of managers, you're now talking about, okay, how does this person who has, many managers reporting to them that each have many teams like effectively operate? But clearly the things they need to be observing, coaching, the things they need to be able to discern about somebody's performance are quite a bit different when you're at second level management on up. So this is another like really big shift as we're talking, Warner, about scaling tech companies is going from a layer of management to like multiple layers of management because I found at each layer the skill set that you need to have starts shifting pretty dramatically. But one thing I do want to call out before I pass it back to you is I really like the point that you made around, the promotion process and like the people that you have and whether or not you put them on a management track. Because I do think one good trend in the tech industry has been, fairly high level and highly compensated IC type roles. Because I think there are people that aren't interested in those responsibilities, but are just technically brilliant. And I think you want to feel like they have, you want those people to feel like they have a path for promotion and growth within the organization that's something other than management, because otherwise, they're likely to move and go on. I do think they have to have some people skills. Like, if you're going to be a staff level or principal level engineer in an organization, presumably you are doing technical work that you are going to have to in some way disseminate to, tens of hundreds of engineers within the organization. So you at least need to be able to like convey some of that knowledge. But I can certainly understand people not wanting to have direct people management responsibilities. And I do think it's critically important to, have a path for that talent.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Dan, when it comes to the dual path approach. And I think it was IBM that actually created that. Weird to attribute, but we're seeing that a lot more now too, because we shouldn't limit our best people's success simply because they're not managing people. I see a lot of organizations where managers will frequently make less than their best
Yeah.
engineering counterparts. I know I have
Yeah,
at
Sam.
different times.
At
Um,
least in
for
cash.
for those interested on or in the management path, there's a book called The Manager's Path. It's written by Camille Fournier. Really solid book. There are a ton of great management books out there, but that one in particular focuses more on what it means to be an engineering manager and a CTO in modern tech companies. Worth a read. And an interesting, I just attended Lead Dev in New York, a really great conference, tech company leaders coming together to talk about management. And in the part of the program that was focused on senior leaders, one of the presenters, Kevin Goldsmith, I believe, been a CTO of many large tech companies. I'm going to paraphrase it from memory, but the way he described the difference between engineering manager focused on team, director maybe focused on multiple teams, and then when you get to VP and start to look across the organization more and think about how you can collaborate and empower different parts of the organization that may or may not be the technology organization. And then CTO being primarily externally focused, thinking further ahead, strategy, product, market, customers, and how to position the company to be successful with that strategy, with technology. I found that to be a really pithy, simple, but on point explanation that I hadn't heard put quite that way before. Um, Well, cool. I'm gonna pivot the conversation a bit, and talk more about cybersecurity, just so we can hit some of the topics that some of our attendees brought to the table. One of the topics that was brought was scaling cybersecurity at a startup with limited resources. I have my own thoughts, of course, more CISO hat, but I'm curious your thoughts, Dan.
Yeah, I'm probably more interested in yours. But it has been important for me in every role I've been in. Just because Braintree, we were handling credit card data. We had to offer PCI compliant services. We had to help our customers become PCI compliant. And, the most important thing for us was safeguarding that credit card information. And, similarly at Root, a little bit less scrutinous, excuse me, and insurance instead of payments, but we had a lot of personal information about people. And certainly once you get into the claims process, sometimes like medical records are even involved and, there's a lot to go through there. Um, But I've always thought that, it's important to figure out, and I hope you'll agree with this, Warner, the right security measures to put in place that still enable people to be able to get work done productively, and just being really thoughtful about like what that looks like. Um, for example, you could probably have the most secure network you possibly could by like air gapping computers. So you're working on workstations that like aren't even connected to the internet, but of course it'd be terrible if an engineer like, I don't know, had to go to a different workstation to like Google something. That's obviously like a ridiculous example, but there are these like security and productivity trade-offs that you have to be really mindful about. So, I think I've always just thought about this in terms of like, okay, what are industry best practices? What are secure defaults? Which frameworks and technologies are we using, and like how do we configure them appropriately? And then gradually just thinking about like what the right controls are to put in place with an eye towards the ones that, as you mentioned, I think at the beginning of our chat here, could be hard to layer in later. Because some of these, the cost of implementing it is kind of proportional to the amount of code or number of systems that you have and everything. And if you do it when you're small, you kind of pay this, little bit of cost as